Hey, Reed Turchy, thanks so much, man, for joining me here on Walking Inside Poems.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for being game to explore these poems together.
You bet, man. Larry Levis. Wow. As I usually do in these episodes, I immerse myself in whatever poet we're talking about that week, and I have gone deep down the hole of
It's
Larry
a
Levis.
dangerous one. It's a very particular one too. So I'm glad you've gotten to dive.
What a fascinating guy, a huge heart, a brilliant poet, a tragic figure in a lot of ways, yeah, I know we're going to talk about the poem "God is Always 17," but as usually happens on these episodes, we'll talk about some of the other poems as well. We'll bring some
Great.
other stuff in there. Hey, before we get into Larry Levis, though, uh, tell our listeners who you are and what you're up to. I will provide links to you in the show notes so people can check out your music and your poetry and everything you're doing. But if you will, just give us kind of a quick potted biography.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, I'm Reed Turchy, still, and I grew up in Swannanoa, North Carolina. And what we'll get into, which will get strange, is I grew up in the Warren Wilson MFA program. My dad was the director there from 93 to '08. And I grew up within that. My world became a musical world, as well as a world of words, which is kind of hard to say. But I studied with Bill Ferris at UNC Chapel Hill, and he is a figure that connects many Southern cultures and music and arts. He was the head of the NEH under Bill Clinton, for example. That was part of it. Anyway, so my life became a life of making music of my own, recording and producing music at various studios and for various entities. And then eventually I did go and get my own actual MFA from that program, and have developed my writing world. So right now, where am I? It's February. I don't know when this will come out, but that's okay.
Very soon. Yeah, yeah, this month.
Um, I have a new album coming out at the end of May that I'm very excited about. I have a string of poems that have come into the world recently, which I'm proud of and happy to see in the world. And then I've got a manuscript that is out in the world finding its way and, still in my heart being developed. So that's where I
Oh,
am.
yeah, the manuscript, is it a novel?
No, it's a collection of poems.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Or a poetry collection, depending on the term of the day.
Yeah, yeah. Well, man, you are the perfect guest for my podcast because I'm a singer-songwriter myself. Uh, been immersed in poetry for a long time. I think you might know I have another podcast called Time to Connect, and most of
Yeah.
those guests there are musicians. But one of the things, and we could really go down this rabbit hole. Let's not go too far down it. But one of the things that I think is fascinating is the connection between songwriting and poetry. They definitely are different, but there are definite similarities. Do you have any kind of high level thoughts on how they differ or how they're the same?
Absolutely no high level thoughts offered. I think I struggle with the connection more than anything else. In in my personal world, or in my personal preferences in poetics or aesthetics that I lean towards, a lot of the poetry I love has so much working in it rhythmically and sonically that it is not something I think of as paired with music. Whereas when I think of songs, when I write songs, I tend to come to a musical idea first, often on guitar, and then find ways to make words work within what that is created.
Yes.
But that said, I've done some collaborations as the poet and as the musician, adding one or the other to the other. So it's not that I don't think they can happen or live together. I guess what I mean is I don't think I've ever had a moment where I've looked at text or thought of text that I'm drafting and thought, is this a poem or is this a song? And I think some people, and maybe you are, have like sort of start at an origin point and say, this is this written thing, or this is this thing I'm expressing. Maybe it will end up as a song, and that's maybe it will end up as a poem. And that's very fascinating to me because that is not how my brain works. But I think a lot of people do sort of operate more from that initial point. And yeah, that's amazing to me, but it's not where I am, at least
Yeah,
today.
I think I'm much like you. I typically writing songs. I start with a on guitar with a melody, and
Hmm.
then it's almost like the words find their way into the melody because, and then meaning comes way later. It and it's I've said this many times on my podcast, but it's a point that I will keep saying. If, you know, anyone who doesn't get this, when you're writing a song, one of the things that's interesting is that you have to match the down to the syllable how it fits in the melody at that moment. And that's one of the things that makes it tough because you can cram something in there, but if it doesn't, you know it when you're singing it. This doesn't work with the melody right here. So that's why I say meaning comes down the road. It's got to kind of taste right in the mouth with the melody before you even get to meaning. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, that feels very much in line with how my process works for that.
Yeah.
And I think too, it's the world we live in today. Most poems exist on the page.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I think if we lived in an era or existed within a culture where the predominant way of reciting poems was recitation out loud, then
Yeah.
I think musical as accompaniment, I mean, let's go back to Sappho. Um, that makes so much more sense. You
Yeah.
strum the thing to emphasize the meter, or you strum the thing to remember as a, memory tool to get through certain sections. If I
Yeah.
was going to sit down and uh, be a Homer and recite at that level, then yeah, some kind of accompaniment to keep a meter or to keep a thing rolling with it, or
Yeah.
like working dervish world and all of that. That's very different. But I think in our contemporary American poetry world of poems existing on the page, like that's a different type of creation to me.
Yeah. Yeah, we typically, I mean, you have liner notes, and I grew up with vinyl, and you really consumed the lyrics that were often in the, on the album jacket, but you didn't think of them in terms of the way they sat on the page. I mean, for example, this poem we're going to look at today has little couplets, one after another, and I don't know whether we want to talk about that or not. Look, before we get into this poem, tell me about Larry Levis and what how you found Levis and what he means to you, just in general.
Yeah, well, I'll just tell my personal version of it, because the Levis biography is one that I can offer some summary of, but it's probably flawed. So the Warren Wilson MFA program is low residency, so everyone's in together for 2 weeks of a semester, and I grew up in that space all year because that is, I mean, my dad was the director. We lived in Swannanoa, and uh, so starting at age 3, I was around this 2 weeks every July, 2 weeks of January, just absolute collection of many of the finest and most serious poets and fiction writers in America, and all of whom were extraordinarily serious about the craft and the teaching, which is what Ellen Bryant Voigt's vision was. It's not a place where you go shop your manuscript. It's a place where you work with people serious on craft. And so for me, Larry Levis was one of the adults in the room who was charmed by a little kid running around.
Mm-hmm.
And, these are all adults, many with families, many of whom are away from their families for 10 days. And, we're pre-internet, pre-cell phone, there was one phone that the faculty would take turns calling home from on campus. And so it was much more a isolated uh, group on the mountain, so to speak, or however you want to describe it. And so, yeah, Larry Levis was one of those friendly sort of adults in the room, excited to have a little kid to dote on or a little kid running around. And then when I was 6, it was right before my birthday. My birthday is May 26th. And Levis died within a few days before my birthday. And so what I remember is the residency takes place in July, but by that point, the semester is kind of closing and the residency planning. And so uh, I mean, Larry or Levis had active students. He was teaching that semester when he passed. And so I remember my dad getting the call that Levis had died and that all of a sudden these students needed to be shuffled around. And I think it's probably deep in my memory because it was close to my birthday. And then as a gift, and as I sort of got more serious about words and arts as like, preteen and all that, my dad gave me a copy of one of Levis's last letters, or his last letter of packet exchange with one of his students from that semester. And I just held that as like the totem of what art should be. It's like a 3-page letter, and we can get into that, but then when I really started to fall into poetry world I mean, I was already there, but when I started to become actively interested in it beyond just what was around me, and hanging out with these MFA students and starting to be someone who felt like someone who could almost pretend to participate in some of these kind of conversations. That one of those students at a bonfire one night, I think I was 11, recited my story in a late style of fire. And so between the like early childhood memories and the sort of birthday, because Charles Wright has a poem that is like writing of Larry Levis's, I mean, the poem is titled, someone will correct this, but like, hearing Larry Levis died in May. And it's
Yeah.
a poem written on my birthday, uh, which is a trip. And so, like, these sort of layers from very early on. And then, so of course, because I was obsessed when I heard that poem recited, and really well recited when I was either 10 or 11, then of course I memorized it. And it's a long poem. So it's a big deal to memorize that for me then. And then I've sort of just had his voice, Levis's voice, sort of loudest and most at the core of many of my poetic memories and influences, because it's always been there. And this, so my story in the late style of fire is probably the poem I'm most familiar with of all poems in the world. And I know we talked about maybe talking about that one, which would have been interesting and also more familiar. God is Always 17 has so many interesting things to talk about, but one of the things that's most interesting for me personally is that it its voice and its pacing and its patterns of thought is exactly the same as that last letter he wrote to his student. It is
Wow.
so clear that he is writing these two things at the same emotional point, the same geographic location, the same cadences, the same perspective on where his life has been and what it is. It's really heartbreaking to see that letter and to see this poem and be like, no, it's the same. At this point, he was just sort of in this mode of expression. And because it's the last mode of expression he reached, we are quick to think of it as like his ultimate state,
Yeah.
um, which we can argue about, but we'll never know the truth of. But it's definitely his final state. And yeah, that's one of the reasons why this poem rings so loud to me, is because I've recognized this voice from when I was 6.
Yeah, that's amazing. And we should point people to the film.
Yeah.
Uh, and in fact, Charles Wright reads, I don't think he reads the entire poem that you referenced, but he reads from that poem in a scene in that film. But yeah, people, if you're at all interested, folks, you should watch that film and get into his poetry. It's amazing. Philip, no less than Philip Levine, U.S. Poet Laureate, his friend, collaborator, called him let's see if I want to get the quote right. He called him the finest poet of his generation, as well as a better poet than his old teacher.
Yeah.
Uh, and of course, there's great quotes from lots of different people. But let's see. So we do want to get into several of his poems, but God is always 17. Why is God always 17? What does that do for you right off the bat when you read that title?
I think it enlarges the world of the poem in a way and establishes a voice and perspective instantly. And Levis's archives are at VCU, and I've poked around in there some in person. And one of the most amazing things is he has another poem called Caravaggio Swirl and Vortex that is frequently up there with his top, and his collected work coming out next year. The title is Swirl and Vortex. That's something a lot of readers latch on to. But what I was looking at dozens and dozens of typewritten and then hand edited drafts of Caravaggio's Swirl and Vortex. And what amazed me was that he comes across as so conversational in his poems, which is, I think, one of the major seductive qualities, is you feel like it's everything you would dream of. It's wise and worldly and thoughtful and deeply empathetic and observational, and it comes off so off the cuff, and everything in his posturing is so off the cuff. But in these drafts of Caravaggio's Swirl and Vortex, the poem began as one poem. The poem's maybe three. It's a little longer than God is Always 17. So it's in long line couplets. It's maybe 3 or 4 pages long. Uh, and it starts as a poem. And then at one point, it becomes 6 or 7 different drafts. And each of those drafts has taken one image in the initial draft and written an entire poem of the same length, just going from that image. And then dozens and dozens of drafts later, the thing recongeals, having like pulled different. And so God is Always 17 as a title. And then what happens in the second and third couplet that gets back to God, but I'd probably lose interest in it and begin wondering about God and whether he's tried the methamphetamine I sent him yet, and if he still listens to the Clash, and whether the new job he got from Mozart as a
Yeah.
janitorial assistant.
Which is what a 17-year-old God would do.
Yeah, and all those references to me make the world so much bigger, and they add such a depth, and they're so considered. Because I think that's such a danger early in any poem, is to throw out these proper noun references that maybe distract from what the poem's getting towards or what the speaker is trying to say in an occasion. But in Larry's case, I think what he does so quietly and so well is offer these like huge things like God, methamphetamines, the Clash, a janitorial assistant in Tulsa. It's not just a janitorial assistant in a school or a janitorial assistant in an office, and take these specific, but like that, it just makes the world of the poem so large right off the bat that then he can inhabit different corners of it. But his awareness to do that is no accident. I don't think he sat down and the first thing he thought was like Mozart, Tulsa, janitorial assistant. That is a studied ability that comes from, I think, reading and writing so much that you become very deft in how to pull those things in. I think it's overlooked how powerful it is.
And he does have that narrative quality that does sound so natural and yet so odd when you really look at these different images and these different ideas. But they do congeal at the end. That's what he does, doesn't he? He has these, seemingly. In fact, I was thinking this morning, this poem reminds me of that film, Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Yeah.
All this stuff happening, but there's a theme that kind of ties it all together. And now, one thing I will say, that film, what tied it all together for me anyway, was that, hey, despite all this insanity and this madness and the meaninglessness of it all, we find solace in love and in making meaning out of the meaninglessness. This poem, I'm not so sure. It feels really dark at the end. It
Oh,
feels
yeah.
really dark. Hey, I'm going to try not to cough because I'm working with a sore throat here, but why don't I read the poem real quickly?
That would
And
be
you
great.
have
Take
it
your
there with
time.
you? Do you have it there with you to read at the end?
Yeah.
Great. And by the way, folks, this comes from this particular book right here. Yep, there we go. This is another amazing one right here, Winter Stars. That poem, Winter Stars itself, is wow. Okay.
Yeah.
God is Always 17. This is the last poem in the book. In a way, I don't even want to finish it. I'd rather go to bed and jack off under the covers, but I'd probably lose interest in it, begin wondering about God and whether he's tried the methamphetamine I sent him yet, and if he still listens to the Clash, and whether the new job he got from Mozart as a janitorial assistant in Tulsa is working out. Besides, I can't imagine a body in the first faint stirrings of arousal without feeling sorry for it now. And anyway, I've built a fire in the fireplace, and I don't have a fire screen yet, and have to watch it until it goes out, even the last lukewarm ember, It isn't my house. It belongs to a bank in St. Louis somewhere, and they have 4,000 different ways to punish me if the place goes up in flames, including the guys from Medellin who work for them now and specialize in pain. Besides, it's still winter everywhere, and maybe you want to hear a story with a fire burning quietly beside it. The story on this night when it got really cold and the darkness of the night spreading over the sky seemed larger than it should have been, though nobody mentioned it. It was something you didn't feel like bringing up if you were sitting in a bar among your friends. But all that happened was the night kept getting larger, then larger still, and then there was a squeal of brakes outside the bar, and then what they call in prose the sickening crunch of metal as two cars collided. And in a little while, the guy went back to telling this story in which the warm snow was falling on the yard where he and the other prisoners were exercising. I guess the guy had evidently done some time, though everyone listening was too polite to bring it up. And what happened in it was a clerk bleeding to death in a 7-Eleven, and the guy telling it called 911 for an ambulance, and the police found both cash from the till and the gun on him when they arrived. He didn't think he'd shot anyone that night or anyone ever, and was surprised and puzzled when they made a match on the gun. The clerk lived to testify, and they convicted him. No one along the bar said anything when he'd finished telling it, and the night went on enlarging in the story, and I think our silence cut him loose and let him go falling. And one by one we paid and got up and left and went out under the stars. I have a child who isn't doing well in school. It's not his grades, it's that he can't wake up. He misses his morning classes and doesn't answer when I call and doesn't return my calls. The last time I saw him, we took the train down from Connecticut to New York and wandered around Times Square. We went into this record store and pretended to browse through some albums there because we didn't know what to say to each other. It was night. It was just before Christmas season, and the clerks in the store would call out loudly, "Can I help anybody?" and "Can I help someone?" And there was some music playing and something inconsolable and no longer even bitter in the melody. And I will never forget being there with him and hearing it and wondering what was going to become of us. Do you share my feeling that it really ends on a dark note?
Yeah, I think it ends on a pretty extraordinarily dark note. Um, I think too what amazes me is how heavy-handed of an ending of it is and how we're bought in and believe the sincerity. Well, it's a fan of Levis does. Maybe someone else reads this poem and gets it and is like, this guy and his whining needs to stop.
Yeah.
I don't know. But but I think I've been thinking a lot about this because I've seen some raging poet debates recently about well, particularly about Levis's very digressive mode sometimes. And I think in our current moment there are such relentless arguments for uh cutting things down tighter and tighter, more and more minimalism, faster, tighter, less lines, fewer words. And it's because a lot of poems are being read on very small screens and no one has the attention span.
So we need to throw Whitman out the window, huh?
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm not revealing my position in this argument, but I am obviously. But I think in this case, I think I can imagine a world in which, for me, it's shocking, right? I mean, you gave that point longer pause, but he tells the story of the guy, or the guy's story nestled within the story, nestled within where the poem starts. But then we get, and one by one, we paid and got up and left and went out under the stars. Midline, I have a child who isn't doing well in school.
Yeah.
And that's the poem is where, I have a child that isn't doing, and it's not, we have no indicator. We don't have a line break, we don't have a new couplet, we don't have a section break, which he sometimes does in longer couplet poems, nothing. And I can hear someone arguing like, well, that's the poem. You should cut everything before that and start with I have a child because that's what the poem is about. But no, I think if I start the poem there and then get to that ending, I don't care. you know, guy has trouble with his kid and the guy is thinking about life. Fine. Like that's too bad and I'm sorry, but that doesn't move me. And so it's all about how the pieces before then get built so that he can pull off that move. And in my story on the late style of fire, the, like this poem announces its occasion from the beginning. I think that's one of the things that draws you in. Here I am. I'm trying to write the last poem in the book. This is what I'm thinking about. This is where I'm sitting. This is the fireplace I'm looking at. And then we go into the mental inner state and the different movements. In my story in a late style of fire, we don't have much sense of the location of the speaker until this one tiny line in the middle of a, it's like what, 80 some lines, 60 some lines, one stanza, fairly long lines, not this long, but fairly long lines. And then all of a sudden he shifts from this imagined scene to sometimes I sit watching a line of trees in this neighborhood. Sometimes I watch the wind bothering a line of trees in this neighborhood, a line of elms in this neighborhood until I feel just like them trembling and in unison. And that is the location of the speaker and the direct revealing of the speaker's state. And it's so hidden among so many other things, just in the way that this transition, I have a child who isn't doing well in school, comes out of nowhere. You know,
Yeah.
we're like three layers into stories within stories, and all of a sudden we get to that. And that's an amazing move. And I think that's a very dramatic jump done in a really quiet way. And I admire that. I really admire that.
And he's a demanding poet. He's not going to hold your hand. He requires a lot of the reader, you know. You're going to miss it. Now where's the line that you were talking about in a late style of fire?
It's like I think it. So he goes on the. It's like between line 30 and 40, I think. But he's talking about the lover, and when he.
Billie Holiday.
Yeah, so we get Billie Holiday, and then we get into his love gone wrong in New York, and then the
Yes,
imagined scene of him watching his house burn down.
yes.
And what would happen in that scenario, which is a pretty amazing set of uh I don't know, just an amazing set of imagined scenes and positions. And then he snaps out of that with, I think, sometimes I sit watching a line of trees, line of elms.
Got
You've
it.
got it.
You know what? I'm going to read it. I'm not going to
Okay,
read.
great.
I'm not going to read the whole poem, but let me read just up to that point. This is an amazing poem. My story in a late style of fire. Whenever I listen to Billie Holiday, I am reminded that I too was once banished from New York City. Not because of drugs or because I was interesting enough for any one overworked patrolman to worry about, his expression usually a great gauzy spider web of bewilderment over his face. I was banished from New York City by a woman. Sometimes, after we had stopped laughing, I would look at her and see a cold note of sorrow or puzzlement go over her face as if someone else were there behind it, not laughing at all. We were, I think, in love. No, I'm sure. If my house burned down tomorrow morning, and if I and my wife and son stood looking on at the flames, and if then someone stepped out of the crowd of bystanders and said to me, "Didn't you once know?" No. But if one of the flames rising up in the scherzo of fire turned all the windows blank with light, and if that flame could speak, and if it said to me, "You loved her, didn't you?" I'd answer, hands in my pockets, yes. And then I'd let fire and misfortune overwhelm my life. Sometimes, remembering those days, I watch a warm, dry wind bothering a whole line of elms and maples along a street in this neighborhood until they're all moving at once, until I feel just like them, trembling and in unison. Wow.
And then you've got half the poem to go.
Oh, yeah. We're not even
Which is,
halfway done yet.
yeah,
Yeah.
which is just the moves are so deft and are so uh yeah, I mean, I've spent a long time with that poem, like personally, but also critically thinking about it. And the way he moves is amazing and I think very hard to do. And Do you know the poet, or either way, the poet Bridget Pegeen Kelly
Yeah.
has the most famous poem, I think, is Song. And if it is amazing, if you look at Song and My Story in a Late Style of Fire, they are not only nearly identical in form, they are nearly identical in their moves.
No
Uh,
kidding.
and how and because like the Levis poem, for example, there starts whenever I listen to Billie Holiday, and then it's like around line 65 he comes back with uh Billie Holiday, whose life was far more tragic than, in the same way, in almost exactly the same positions in Song. It starts with listen, and then around line 60 or 65 we come back to listen.
Mm,
And that so and they were both teaching at Warren Wilson at the same time.
interesting.
um and yeah, I don't know, I mean, that style of narrative poem was more in favor aesthetically in American poetry then, I think. But yeah, they were definitely around each other.
Yeah.
uh
Yeah,
and
I need to have an episode on her for sure. I need to find, if you know someone who would be a logical person to talk about her, I definitely would like. I think she's got a poem. Is it Black Swan? I believe is the title
yeah.
of it. Knocks me out. But hey, let's talk just a minute. And I can't believe how time is slipping up on us here. But let's talk a little bit about Levis himself, because one of the things I think is interesting about him. You would definitely not call him a confessional poet, not in the sense of the confessional poets, and yet we know his life was pretty tragic with respect to alcohol, drugs, depression, a series of failed marriages and failed relationships. And he puts it all in there, man. He is definitely a personal poet in the sense that, this poem we just read from, um, he's talking about basically having being married and yet having another woman on the side, and that was he in fact wasn't, I think it came out in that film that in one of his marriages his wife found out he was having an affair because he was reading a poem out loud about it. And so I find that
What a
interesting.
move.
Yeah, I find that interesting that, like I said, you wouldn't call him a confessional poet, and yet he bleeds all over the page and his personal life is there.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of what makes his cult following that is out there so strong. But I think what's important to keep in mind is that he read everything. Um, in terms of, I mean, his knowledge of poetry and his breadth and knowledge of different poets was so wide and so considered that I think uh, though there is a lot of his personal biography that show up in the poems, that is rarely the subject as much as it is a position from which to see the world, or a position of which to examine something. And that's where I think less successful poems fall short. And I think as so I was recently, I know I'm late to this party, but I was recently reading Diane Seuss's Frank Sonnets, which is stunning. And in one of those sonnets, she references a Gregory Orr book called Poetry of Survival. And in it, Orr describes the poet's trajectory as going from choked silence to like an outpouring of speech to diary to storytelling, and then finally to poetry.
Mhm.
And I think that is incredibly astute. I mean, we could argue different parts of it, but I think if you think of like Levis's poems here, you see that, like, yes, there's a diary element in that there's details from his personal life that ground us, and yes, there's a lot of storytelling, but neither of those things are the end. Neither of those things are the ultimate. Hey, I'm here to tell you. I mean, he even makes fun of it in this poem. Here, it's a cold winter night. Let me tell you a story. But then that story gets him to the thing about his son. And the thing about his son is also kind of a story, but not, I mean, that's what, if you believe these poems succeed, that's, I think, to me, what makes them transcend, is that they don't stop with like, hey, look, I ruined my life and look how miserable I am now, or I ruined my life, but I had to do it, so here's my sort of proud confession of being a bad person, kind of.
Yeah,
And I think
yeah.
we see a lot of a lot of poems and a lot of poets kind of get stuck there because it's emotion on the page, people react. But I think using that to reach to a higher thing or to ask more complicated questions. I noticed when you were reading, uh, one of because I had made a note about how he has so many proper noun specifics and then also so many complete vagaries. Anyone, anywhere, somewhere, someone, like, and one of my favorites is just ridiculous, or two of that are back to back in this poem. It belongs to a bank in St. Louis somewhere. Like, no, it's St. Louis, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and
He
like so
doesn't say somewhere in St. Louis. He says in St. Louis somewhere.
where? So it's like what? So now St. Louis, which is a proper noun, then immediately becomes like a figurative St. Louis by tacking on the somewhere. And then following right on the heels of that, besides, it's still winter everywhere. Like,
Yeah.
no, it's not. I mean, that's not the if you believe the globe is a, a sphere is a globe, then it can't be winter everywhere. So it's like, okay, like, but he just slips those in and it constructs the world in a way that is that I mean, like we were saying with what the title does, like it just makes this immense canvas and like that he can plot around and pull the reader into this world where St. Louis is a somewhere and everywhere is winter.
Yeah.
It's extraordinarily effective storytelling, like in the ancient sense of storytelling, not in the like what's a novel in 2025 type of
Right.
storytelling.
Right. It would be easy to get schmaltzy about how he almost had to die young. He's like a rock star. He gave his life to poetry. He did. He gave his life to poetry. I mean, he decided early on this was going to be my life. And I think maybe in that film was where I heard this. Someone said he was what's the guy's name who did put this book together? St. John.
Yeah,
Um,
David St. John.
David St. John said, I've never known a poet more obsessed with writing poetry than him. Carolyn Forche said that he let the world in. He let the world wound his heart. And like a lot of the poets on this series, by the way, Frank Stanford, Everette Maddox, he's a guy who sort of died devoted to this, to his art in a way that's almost like a rock star. He
And he
is.
drove a motorcycle and wore a black leather jacket and, was incredibly sexy and women loved him. I mean,
He's
but I mean,
he's he's the poet on the motorcycle, man.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, I don't know if you found this one yet. It's hard to track down copies of, but there's this amazing book called A Condition of the Spirit. And it's divided into four parts, which are uh, Levis's analytical writing, like his critical writing. Uh-oh, now I'm not going to remember them fast enough. It's that there are remembrances from
Okay.
friends, and which are some amazing and heartbreaking essays. And then there's a collection of critical essays about his work,
What's
which
it
are
called?
it's called A Condition of the Spirit.
Okay.
And it was published, I think it was published pretty soon after his death by Eastern Washington University Press. Um, and yeah, and there are oh no, copyright 2004. Um, and there are, yeah, so the sections are officially titled Some of the Life, Larry Levis on Poetry, Response to the Work, and Epilogue. Um, And it's an amazing, I've never seen a collection quite like this for a poet, but it's the collection of like the personal remembrances, the analysis of his work, and then seeing how he was in conversation with other poets is amazing. And I think the most moving part of it is that everyone just relentless, even people, I think what's sort of not talked about as much is that Levis won some big prizes really early. He was a golden boy of a certain subset of American poetry to the point that people resented, hearing about the young Larry Levis star. Uh, and there are some of those people that write in this book and people who were very begrudging to enjoy his work or let themselves meet him and not just feel like I'm tired of hearing the hype about this guy. And all of them say, whether there are people who loved him from the beginning or who didn't, say that his warmth and uh, graciousness, but more generosity with poetry and with other people's works and with how he read other poems was really the saving grace of it all. So, like, poet on the motorcycle, poet dies young, rock star poet, absolutely. I think there's so much seduction there and there's so much following, but the generosity of spirit and the just relentless openness to engaging very seriously with other people's work. I mean, that's the real contribution of the life, I think.
He was a romantic. I mean,
Yeah.
he was sweet. He was dear. Hey, I want you to take, if you don't mind, take us out by reading the poem. But before you do, I just want to put a flag in this. We're sort of out of time, but and maybe I'll put a link in the show notes. I told you in our correspondence before we started this that just by coincidence or serendipity, I had the poet Matthew Lipman on this series last week talking about Alan Dugan, and I just came across today a poem by Matthew called "Larry Levis is an Alien That Knows God Will Always Be 17." It's a wonderful little poem. I will put a link to that so people can read that in the show notes. But if you don't mind, Reed, why don't you take us out by reading the poem one more time? And hey, man, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, and I, probably run my mouth too much, but there's a lot to talk about, and the spiraling happens so fast to try to understand some of these things.
Well, man,
Uh,
down the road, after I've done 20 or 30 of these things, maybe we'll have episode 2 and look at a different Levis poem.
that would be a pleasure.
Cool.
Uh, so yeah, God is always 17. This is the last poem in the book. In a way, I don't even want to finish it. I'd rather go to bed and jack off under the covers, but I'd probably lose interest in it and begin wondering about God and whether he's tried the methamphetamine I sent him yet, and if he still listens to The Clash, and whether the new job he got from Mozart as a janitorial assistant in Tulsa is working out. Besides, I can't imagine a body in the first faint stirrings of arousal without feeling sorry for it now. And anyway, I've built a fire in the fireplace, and I don't have a fire screen yet, and have to watch it until it goes out, even the last lukewarm ember. It isn't my house. It belongs to a bank in St. Louis somewhere, and they have 4,000 different ways to punish me if the place goes up in flames, including the guys from Medellin who work for them now and specialize in pain. Besides, it's still winter everywhere. And maybe you want to hear a story with a fire burning quietly beside it. The story on this night when it got really cold and the darkness of the night spreading over the sky seemed larger than it should have been, though nobody mentioned it. It was something you didn't feel like bringing up if you were sitting in a bar among your friends. But all that happened was the night kept getting larger, then larger still. And then there was a squeal of brakes outside the bar, and then what they call in prose the sickening crunch of metal as two cars collided. And in a little while, the guy went back to telling this story, in which the warm snow was falling on the yard where he and other prisoners were exercising. I guess the guy had evidently done some time, though everyone listening was too polite to bring it up. And what happened in it was a clerk bleeding to death in a 7-Eleven, and the guy telling it called 911 for an ambulance. And the police found both cash from the till and the gun on him when they arrived. He didn't think he'd shot anyone that night, or anyone ever, and was surprised and puzzled when they made a match on the gun. The clerk lived to testify, and they convicted him. No one along the bar said anything when he'd finished telling it, and the night went on enlarging in the story, and I think our silence cut him loose and let him go falling. And one by one, we paid and got up and left and went out under the stars. I have a child who isn't doing well in school. It's not his grades, it's that he can't wake up. He misses his morning classes and doesn't answer when I call and doesn't return my calls. The last time I saw him, we took the train down from Connecticut to New York and wandered around Times Square. We went into this record store and pretended to browse through some albums there because we didn't know what to say to each other. It was night. It was just before the Christmas season, and the clerks in the store would call out loudly, "Can I help anybody?" and "Can I help someone?" And there was some music playing and something inconsolable and no longer even bitter in the memory, and I will never forget being there with him and hearing it and wondering what was going to become of us.
Larry Levis. Woo! Reed Turchi, thank you again so much for doing this. I wish you all the best with your music and your poetry and anything else you're involved in. And I hope we meet in person sometime.
Yeah, we will. Yeah, let me know if you're ever up here in the biggest of apples, and I'll let you know if I'm back in Texas, which I hope to be. I will
Right
be
on.
on.
Take
Cool.
care.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.